I wanted to make a quick video, excuse me, to explain all of the documents we have related to the first paper. So I'm using right here the web section of the of the AFAM 204 class. And when you look in week 4, you will see that for next week we have a documentary about Toni Morrison, but we also have a couple of more documents that relate to writing the first paper. So the assignment that you can click is right here. And in the assignment, I have a lot of background information and just a lot of other things to think about. The main idea that I want to put forward here as you look at the assignment and this information is that the myth of white supremacy says that African American culture or African American history are outside of and different from American culture in general. And white supremacy says that without addressing its own racial viewpoint, which of course is white. That's a kind of dominant idea, and the reason that the media attacks critical race theory, attacks African American culture, and also attacks African American history. Most people in the United States don't know the difference between African American culture, African American history, and critical race theory. And it's not hugely important that you understand that. But the point is that the misrepresentation of all of these things that you will see is just another way that Americans try to say African Americans are outside of what American means, something separate, something outside, something different. And according to white supremacy, something that is not quite as good. So these are the quick directions for the paper, and have another example, a recent example of Americans who seem to think that African American history and ideas and culture is outside of the mainstream and outside of what American really means. So to help explain a little bit how this happened, why people have these ideas, there is another document here called Putting It All Together that explains the things that we have read so far and the kind of outsiderness that Ta-Nehisi Coates or James Baldwin talk about, or that even Langston Hughes talks about, and the reasons that that developed, but also the reasons that it hurts the United States, hurts everybody really, to push African Americans outside. So this is just the through line explanation of the interconnection between the videos that we have watched and the readings that we have looked at. And the through line and the important part isn't that African American culture has been pushed outside. The important message is that African American culture and African American history have so much of value and beauty and importance for as part of American history that if we don't look at African American history, we're missing the best points in the story, the best parts of the story, the greatest things about freedom and about American values. So this document just explains that a little bit. And finally, this document is a summary of your ideas from the scavenger hunt at the very beginning. First of all, with the idea of of cultural syncretism, the 20th century media and that racial hierarchy and the idea of white supremacy is founded on cultural differences that cast blacks as permanent outsiders, and that's Paul Gilroy's argument. However, Gilroy's idea of cultural syncretism tells us that, in fact, the whole experience of transatlantic slavery is critical to the development of the modern world as we know it. And therefore, we cannot say that African American history, for example, isn't the same as or in the center of American history. In culture, this is just a little bit of a description about how culture goes beyond our intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. Culture is also a weapon that historically white supremacists used, and culture is also a process that African American communities have used to hold together, to persevere, to demonstrate resilience, and to create beauty in the face of a lot of lies and myths and scientific racism and a lot of values and ideals that dominant cultures of the colonial world imposed on the rest of the world. Not to say that there's no value to dominant American culture or European culture, but that if you look at those cultures without considering how African American culture makes them better, you're really missing out on part of the picture. And yes, certainly we have exploitation, economic exploitation, cultural exploitation, and we have cultural imperialism. And Thomas Jefferson had something to do with that, which is not to say that Thomas Jefferson never had a decent idea or that the Declaration of Independence isn't important. It's simply to say that we need to look at the rest of American history and include African American culture in the discussion too. And here in our large amount of documents that we have, if you find it helpful, I have all of our handouts from the entire semester. We have a handout from Coates. We have some summaries of James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. Here we have some sample papers that are PDFs that did a really great job on this paper, and some of the comments that I made on those papers, as well as the rubric that I use to grade your papers. And the very last document that you can look at in here is a paper from AFAM 204 last year that won an award. And it is, again, a paper that's simply saying, okay, people who have been excluded, but African Americans have always known that we are part of the world, and what we bring to the world is beautiful and important. That's generally the argument that you might put together with a variety of sources for this paper. And you want to use Coates and Baldwin and the Apollo video and various of the sources that we've read thus far to back up your argument. So again, this has already gotten a little bit long, but I just wanted to help you navigate through some of the things that you can use to write your paper. Have a great weekend.